welcome to episode 6 of Battlefield Next. My name is Major J.Covey. Before we get started with this episode, let's do some housekeeping. First, the views expressed on the podcast are the views of the participants and do not necessarily represent those of the Judge Advocate General's Legal Center and School, the U.S. Army, the Department of Defense, or any other agency of the U.S. government. Today's episode is an interview of Mr. John Norton Moore, the Walter L. Brown Professor of Law Emeritus at the University of Virginia School of Law, by Major Travis J. Covey, Vice Chair and Professor of Law in the National Security Law Department at the Judge Advocate General's Legal Center and School. The episode is an addendum to the 13th Solf Warren Chair Lecture given by Mr. Moore at the Judge Advocate General's Legal Center and School. So, without further delay, we move to the podcast.
All right, good afternoon. My name is Major Travis Covey. I am the Vice Chair at the National Security Law Department here at the Army JAG School. It's my pleasure today to get to interview Professor Emeritus John Norton Moore from University of Virginia School of Law. How are you, sir?
Just fine, Major. It's always a great pleasure to be here at the Judge Advocate General's Legal Center and School, which is one of the finest educational institutions in the world dealing with critical national security issues.
Oh, we appreciate that, sir. So today we just wrapped up the 13th annual Solf Warren Lecture on National Security Law. You were our lecturer today. We really enjoyed that. You were also the 1983, the original Solf Warren, or Solf lecture it was then. It was the Solf lecture, and then it became the Solf Warren lecture. You were the first one in 1983, is that correct?
That's correct, 37 years ago, and I started my lecture today to the group by saying I don't have the foggiest remembrance of what I talked about 37 years ago.
So why don't you fill our listeners in on sort of, for those that may be unaware, your background in national security law and how you came about becoming one of the leading experts in this field?
National security law has basically been my baby for many years. I taught the first course ever taught in national security law and created the first really comprehensive casebook in national security law some years ago. We were at our third edition when I retired recently from the University of Virginia School of Law. And I'd also chaired the American Bar Association Standing Committee on National Security Law. In fact, I'm the one that gave its name to it, of the Committee on National Security Law, and chaired that for about 4 different terms. So I've lived with this field for many, many years, and obviously to do so have great admiration and have worked very closely with the United States military and our Army JAG particularly, since we were so blessed to have the Army JAG School and Legal Center immediately adjacent to the University of Virginia School of Law in Charlottesville, Virginia.
Great. Well, I'll tell you, sir, I mean, for those of us that deal with this field, I mean, I don't think there's a single one of us that aren't familiar with the books that you've got your name on and the writings that you've given. Can you just give us sort of a quick overview of what it was you lectured on today?
Be happy to. The lecture today was on defending defense in the law of jus ad bellum, and I refer to this as a contemporary crisis. And as you know, the creation of an effective right of defense is extremely important. And one of the greatest concerns and risk out there is when the law begins to be turned on itself in a way that it differentially imposes cost on aggression and does it on defense instead of on the aggression, or it begins to confuse aggression and defense or treat the two the same. And when that happens, you're really losing the deterrent effect of law itself. It's almost like an autoimmune disease. It will have turned the international order's own immune system against itself and encouraging aggression. And I'm afraid we live in a world that's doing that a little too much. And so this was a cry to a group that works in this field every day that we really need to focus on restoring jus ad bellum to the proper understanding under the United Nations Charter.
What do you think the next steps are in order to make sure that occurs?
Well, I think part of it is understanding how we got here. Where did the crisis come from? And on that, I think it's really three principal causes. The first of those is new forms of clandestine aggression, which make it harder for the general population to perceive that an attack is taking place. In turn, this creates confusion that the open defensive response is itself the attack. The second cause is a steady erosion of the right of defense. I'm sorry to say, within my own international law community, and also in some of the mistaken decisions on use of force from the International Court of Justice. And then I think a third effect, perhaps more an effect than a cause like the first two, is that totalitarian aggressors have increasingly understood that international institutions such as the International Court of Justice are open for the aggressor's use to attack the defensive response. That is, the aggressors have learned to use what's been called lawfare against the defensive response.
Wow. So looking forward, what is your, I know during your lecture today, you mentioned some things you're working on going forward. Can you expand on that?
Well, I think there are a number of things that we need to understand to try to get back to the classic concept of the law fully supporting a very effective right of defense. The first of those is we have to recognize the centrality of the UN Charter's use of force provisions. That's the one that governs lawfulness of the initiation of force in international relations. And so if there is some asserted customary international law that's counter to the Charter, it is the Charter that basically governs. And today, many of the what I call minimalist interpretations of the Charter that are undermining the right of effective defense are things that really do not have adequate state practice behind them to be creating customary international law. I think a second thing is to get back to the notion of the correct meaning and history of the United Nations Charter, because when you look at it and look at the travaux of the Charter, it's very, very clear that the draftsman of Article 2.4, that was the key provision on use of force, were very, very clear in what they wrote that the right of defense would not be impaired. In fact, let me just give you a couple of quotes, one from the Commission 1, Committee 1, final report, quote, "The use of arms in legitimate self-defense remains admitted and unimpaired." And then in addition to that, Subcommittee 11A, that was the one drafting the proposal for Article 2, subparagraph 4 of the Charter, reported, quote, "It was clear to the subcommittee that the right of self-defense against aggression should not be impaired or diminished." So unfortunately, there's been a tendency of minimalists, as I call them, to simply look at the language in Article 51 of the Charter of, quote, "if an armed attack occurs," end quote, to basically challenge the legitimacy of response in settings of secret warfare or indirect aggression or terrorism and other such settings that don't have full field armies moving across national boundaries. And unfortunately, there's very little understanding that in the drafting of the charter, that was done in another committee, not the committee basically dealing with primary responsibility for lawful use of force under the charter. It was done dealing with the role of the Security Council and a variety of other issues on regional arrangements. And Article 51 actually came out of a discussion on regional arrangements, and it was one in which the Latin American countries wanted to make sure that they would have a right of defense under the new Inter-American Treaty that was going to be set up, that is today the Rio Treaty. So it was not designed to override or to take away from the correct meaning of Article 2, subparagraph 4 of the Charter.
And as I understand it, you mentioned today that there's a distinction with the sort of the traditional U.S. view of treaty interpretation versus, I guess, an international perspective. Is that correctly characterizing it?
Yes, this is a matter of the permissibility of reviewing negotiating history, or travaux preparatoires in the French, of a treaty and the interpretation of that treaty. And the American view, as reflected in Supreme Court decisions and American practice, is that it is permissible, indeed usually desirable, to consult the negotiating history of a treaty in interpreting provisions of the treaty. What I refer to as this minimalist interpretation of the Charter, a textualist approach, is predominantly a European view of treaty interpretation as embodied today in the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. But I will always remember the outrage expressed against that approach by my professor of law at Yale and mentor, Myers McDougall, who had been a member of the United States delegation of the Vienna Convention negotiations. And in large part because of that difference in treaty interpretation, the United States, 50 years after the conclusion of the Vienna Convention, is still not a party, but this goes far beyond the difference in treaty interpretation between Americans and a European, or some might say a different approach than the American approach. And that is that even under the Vienna Convention, a strict textualist approach, it is permissible to look at that negotiating history when the meaning of a provision of a treaty is ambiguous. And in this particular case, it's absolutely clear what those ambiguities are in the text of the UN Convention and the Charter. And if you'd like me to go through those four, I would be happy to do that.
Oh, sure, sir.
Well, the first of the semantic and syntactic ambiguities in the text of the UN Charter itself is that would not Article 2.4, negotiated in Commission 1, on the purposes and principles of the Charter, which was clearly felt by the framers to be the general provision concerning the scope of the right of defense, prevail if in conflict with Article 51, negotiated in Commission 3, on regional arrangements. In other words, to interpret the Charter use of force provisions, there are two principal provisions, not just one. Article 2, subparagraph 4, and Article 51. The second is that the language of Article 51 itself, counter to this minimalist interpretation, is not clear. For if the right of individual or collective self-defense is an inherent or natural right, can such a right be limited by the subsequent phrase in the same article of if an armed attack occurs? And then third, the equally authentic French version of Article 51 uses the language, quote, agression armée, rather than the English version, armed attack. That language seems to point to the broader traditional terminology of aggression. The fourth point is that there's an ambiguity even in the if an armed attack occurs language. Doesn't mean that we're simply looking at an example of a lawful setting of defense, or was it intended to mean if and only if an armed attack occurs? And the minimalist interpretation is that very narrow if and only if, but that's not the way the language was written.
It's a lot to absorb there, sir. We really appreciate that. I would encourage those that are interested in this, which I think if you're listening to this, you probably are, to go ahead and listen to your entire lecture that you gave earlier. It's going to be available in multiple forums. But I guess one of the last things I'd like to ask you is, you said you didn't really remember what you covered 37 years ago in the original Solf lecture, 1903. What, looking back on it, just some words of wisdom, what would you, if you were going to give one again in 37 years, what do you think you'd like to hope has happened, has changed from now until then, looking forward, I guess?
Well, I certainly hope that 37 years from now, we will be protecting the right of defense more effectively and interpreting the Charter correctly as it was intended to be interpreted, as opposed to certain decisions of the use of force, the International Court of Justice, and things like the Israeli wall case, in which the International Court of Justice astoundingly said that there was no right of defense against non-state actors, but Israel had simply built the wall to try to protect itself in that setting.
Well, like I said, my name is Major Travis Covey here with the National Security Law Department at the Army JAG School, and I'm sitting with Professor John Norton Moore, our 13th annual Solf Warren lecture, and we really appreciate having you come out. And all that you've done for us and all that you've done for the school. Our newly honorary faculty member made today. We really appreciate that, sir. Thank you very much.
It's always a privilege and a pleasure to be here. I have the highest regard for the United States Army JAG Corps. Absolutely fabulous group of some of our finest lawyers, international lawyers in the country.
Thank you, sir, very much. And for those of you that didn't get a chance to listen to the lecture today, I would encourage you to go on and listen to that lecture, which should be available on the JAG website. Thank you.
That's it for episode 6. For more information related to FCD, you can follow us on Twitter at JAGFCD or by visiting our webpage. Finally, if you like what you hear, please leave us a review on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast app. While this is a podcast created by U.S. Army Judge Advocates from the Future Concepts Directorate, our goal is to reach other judge advocates and lawyers across the DoD, law students, and members of academia. Your reviews help make this possible.